The day my wife's boss fired me, she laughed. What she didn't know was that the man she was watching walk out of that office was the same man who had the power to decide whether her company survived. I still remember the sound of that laugh. Not because it was loud, not because it was cruel, but because it came from the one person I expected to stand beside me. My name is Ethan Walker, and for most of my life, I believed respect was something you earned through hard work, loyalty, and the way you treated people when nobody was watching. I was wrong. Sometimes people only respect what they can see. And sometimes, the person standing closest to you is the last person to recognize your worth. The conference room on the 23rd floor of Caldwell Technologies was colder than usual that morning. The glass walls looked out over downtown Chicago, where thousands of people moved through their day believing they knew exactly who they were. Inside that room, I was about to learn how quickly a person's reputation could disappear when someone powerful decided to rewrite the story. Richard Caldwell sat at the end of the table, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his coffee untouched beside a stack of papers. He was the kind of man who filled a room without raising his voice. Everyone watched him. Everyone waited for his approval. I had worked under him for almost 3 years as a strategic advisor. My job was simple on paper. Find weaknesses, identify opportunities, and help the company make smarter decisions. I wasn't the person giving speeches at conferences. I wasn't the face on magazine covers. I preferred it that way. I liked working behind the scenes. But that morning, Richard looked at me like I was a problem he had already solved. "Ethan," he said calmly, "we've decided your position is no longer necessary." The words landed quietly. No shouting. No argument. Just a sentence that changed everything. I looked around the room. A few executives avoided eye contact. Others stared at their laptops like they suddenly became the most interesting things in the world. Nobody wanted to be connected to the person being removed. I nodded slowly. "I understand." Richard leaned back in his chair. "The company is moving in a different direction. We need people who can keep up with the future." There it was. The polite version of an insult. The suggestion that I was outdated. Replaceable. I gathered my notebook, closed my laptop, and stood up. I didn't argue because I knew something most people forget. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. When I walked out into the hallway, I saw Claire standing near the elevator. My wife. The woman I had spent 12 years building a life with. She was wearing a navy business suit, holding her phone in one hand, looking completely comfortable in that world. For a second, I thought she might ask if I was okay. I thought she might tell me that we would figure things out together. Instead, she smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a worried smile. A genuine smile. "Ethan," she said, almost amused, "you really should have seen this coming." I felt something inside me go quiet. Not anger. Not sadness. Just realization. "You knew?" I asked. Claire shrugged. "Richard mentioned it yesterday. Honestly, I think this might be good for you. Maybe now you can find something more stable." Stable. The word stayed with me. She said it as if the years I spent advising companies, solving problems, and protecting investments meant nothing. She looked at me like I was a man who had fallen behind. "You always said you wanted a simpler life," she added. "Maybe this is your chance." The elevator doors opened. Claire stepped inside. Then she looked back and laughed softly. "Don't take it personally. It's just business." The doors closed between us. I stood there alone in that polished hallway, surrounded by people rushing past me, and I realized something I had never admitted before. Claire didn't know me anymore. She knew the version of me she had decided to believe in. The quiet husband. The man without a title. The person standing in the background while everyone else took credit. What she didn't know was that I had spent years choosing silence over recognition. What she didn't know was that my name was connected to decisions she never saw. And what Richard Caldwell didn't know was that firing me was about to become the most expensive mistake of his career. After I left Caldwell Technologies that afternoon, I drove home without turning on the radio. The city moved around me like nothing had happened. Cars filled the streets, people walked into coffee shops, and office buildings continued glowing behind thousands of windows. Everyone was carrying a story I could not see. The strange thing about losing something important is that the world does not stop with you. The world keeps moving, even when your own life feels like it has been paused. I parked my car outside the house Claire and I had chosen together 12 years earlier. It was a quiet neighborhood outside Chicago, the kind of place where people waved when they passed each other and remembered whose dog belonged to which family. From the outside, everything looked perfect. A well-kept home, 2 successful professionals, a comfortable life. But appearances have a way of hiding the cracks underneath. I walked through the front door and saw the framed photographs on the wall. Our wedding day, our first house, vacations we took before our careers became the center of our lives. Looking at those pictures, I remembered a different version of Claire, a woman who once believed in me before anyone knew my name. Back then, I was not impressive on paper. I was not wearing expensive suits or attending executive meetings. I was a young analyst working long hours, learning everything I could about business strategy. Claire used to tell people I was the smartest person she knew. She used to say I saw opportunities where others only saw problems. But somewhere along the way, things changed. Success entered her life faster than mine. Her career at Caldwell Technologies took off. She became known as one of Richard Caldwell's most trusted executives. Invitations started arriving. Important meetings, industry events, conversations with people whose names appeared in financial magazines. I was proud of her. I truly was. I never wanted to compete with my wife. I wanted to support her. But slowly, the way she looked at me began to change. Small moments at first, almost impossible to notice. When friends asked what I did, Claire started answering before I could. Ethan helps with consulting projects, she would say. The words sounded harmless, but the meaning behind them felt different. She stopped talking about my work with the same confidence she once had. She started measuring success by titles, positions, and appearances. I noticed it, but I ignored it. I told myself every marriage goes through seasons. People change. Priorities shift. That was easier to believe than admitting the person beside me was becoming someone I no longer recognized. That evening, after the news of my dismissal spread through the company, Claire came home later than usual. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee when she walked in. She placed her designer handbag on the counter and looked at me. For a moment, there was silence. "Are you upset?" she asked. It was a strange question. Not, "Are you okay?" Not what happened. Just whether I was upset. I looked at her carefully. "I am disappointed," I said. "There is a difference." Claire sighed and opened the refrigerator. "Ethan, you cannot pretend this came out of nowhere. Richard has been saying the company needs a younger perspective." Younger perspective. Another polite phrase that meant something else. "You think I failed?" I asked. She paused. "I think you stopped trying." That sentence stayed with me longer than the firing itself. Because Richard Caldwell did not know my history. He did not know the decisions I had helped shape behind closed doors. He only knew the version of me he saw sitting quietly in meetings. But Claire did know me. Or at least, she used to. She knew every sacrifice, every late night, every difficult decision. She knew how much I had given up because I believed we were building a life together. Yet now she looked at me like I was a man who had simply fallen behind. "Maybe this is a sign," she said. "A sign that you need to finally figure out what you want." I nodded slowly. Not because I agreed. Because I understood. There was a difference between someone not knowing your value and someone choosing not to see it. That night, after Claire went upstairs, I opened an old storage box in my office. Inside were documents I had kept for years, notes from meetings, early business plans, letters from people who once trusted my judgment. Most people thought I was just an employee who gave advice. They never saw the bigger picture. They never saw the relationships I built. They never saw the agreements that existed because I was the person who connected the right people at the right time. I looked at one document sitting at the bottom of the box. A document I had not touched in years. A document connected to the biggest investment decision Caldwell Technologies had ever received. I closed the folder and placed it back where it belonged. Not because I was afraid. Because I was not ready to reveal anything yet. For 12 years, I had watched people judge me by what they could see. Now I wanted to know something important. If everything I had built disappeared from their view, who would still believe in me? The answer was becoming clear. And that answer was more painful than losing a job. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. That had always been my habit. For years, I started my days early, not because someone forced me to, but because I believed preparation created opportunities. The quiet hours before the world became busy were when I could think clearly. But that morning felt different. The house was the same. The kitchen was the same. The coffee machine made the same sound it always did. Yet everything around me felt unfamiliar. Losing my position at Caldwell Technologies should have been the thing that bothered me the most. Instead, the hardest part was realizing that my own wife had already decided who I was. A failure. A man who had stopped moving forward. Someone she believed needed to catch up with the life she had built. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the empty chair across from me. For 12 years, Claire had sat there every morning. Sometimes we talked about our plans. Sometimes we talked about nothing at all. But lately, even silence between us felt different. It felt like we were sitting across from strangers. I spent the morning making calls and reviewing my options. I could have contacted former colleagues. I could have accepted offers from companies that had reached out to me before. I had connections throughout the industry, people who respected my work. But I did not make those calls. Not yet. There was something I needed to understand first. I needed to know whether Claire truly believed what she had said or whether she was simply reacting to the situation. People say things when they are disappointed. People make mistakes. I wanted to believe that was all this was. By noon, I received a message from an old colleague named Marcus Reed. We had worked together years earlier on several investment projects. His message was simple. Heard what happened. Are you okay? I stared at those words for a long time. It was interesting how a person who was no longer part of my daily life could show more concern in one sentence than someone I shared a home with. I replied that I was fine. It was the same answer I had given for years. Fine. A small word that people use when the truth is too complicated to explain. Later that afternoon, I stopped by a small coffee shop near Lake Michigan. It was one of my favorite places because nobody there knew my background. Nobody cared about titles. Nobody cared about corporate rankings. People came in, ordered coffee, and lived their lives. I sat near the window and watched people walk by. That was when I noticed how much of my identity had become connected to being useful to others, solving problems, giving advice, helping companies avoid mistakes. I had spent so much time building value quietly that I forgot some people only recognize value when it comes with a title attached. My phone rang. It was Claire. I answered. Hello. Ethan, are you coming to the Caldwell event tonight? She asked. For a moment, I was confused. The company event was something we had planned to attend together before everything happened. I'm not sure, I said. There was a pause. I think you should still come. Her voice sounded different. Not warmer. More careful. Why? I asked. Because people are asking questions, she replied. That sentence told me everything. Not because she missed me. Not because she wanted to support me. Because my absence created an uncomfortable situation for her. What kind of questions? I asked. You know how people are, she said. They notice things. I looked out the window at the passing cars. It was almost strange. The day before, I had been removed from her company. Now she was worried about how my absence looked. Claire, I said quietly, when I walked out of that office yesterday, did you think about how I felt? The silence on the other end lasted longer than I expected. Ethan, this is not fair. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because it was familiar. Whenever I asked for understanding, somehow the conversation became about why I was asking. I just think you are overreacting, she said. It was a business decision. A business decision. Another phrase that made everything sound simple. But marriage was not a business contract. Loyalty was not a quarterly report. Respect was not something that could be measured on a spreadsheet. After we ended the call, I sat there for a few more minutes. Then I made a decision. I would attend the event. Not for Claire. Not for Richard Caldwell. Not to prove anything. I would go because I needed to see the truth with my own eyes. I needed to know exactly how far this had gone. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror wearing a simple dark suit. Nothing expensive. Nothing designed to attract attention. Just the same kind of suit I had worn countless times before. The difference was that this time I was not walking into the room hoping people would see me. I was walking in knowing they never had. And soon, they would learn the difference between a man who had no power and a man who had simply chosen not to show it. The event hall on the 32nd floor of Caldwell Technologies was filled with the kind of energy that only existed in places where people believed success was something they could measure. Crystal lights reflected across polished tables. Executives in tailored suits moved between conversations about market growth, new partnerships, and future plans. Everyone looked confident. Everyone looked like they belonged. I walked through those doors knowing exactly how they saw me. Not as someone important. Not as someone who had influenced major decisions. Just as Ethan Walker, the man who had recently been removed from the company. I noticed the whispers before I even reached the main room. People did not need to say much. Sometimes a glance explained everything. Claire was already there, standing with Richard Caldwell and several senior executives. She looked completely comfortable. She belonged in that world. For years, I had been happy watching her succeed. I had never wanted her spotlight. I never needed my name on every presentation or my picture in every article. But standing there that evening, I realized something. Claire had started confusing my choice to stay quiet with a lack of ambition. Richard noticed me first. His smile was polite, but there was no warmth behind it. "Ethan," he said, shaking my hand briefly. "Glad you could make it." I returned the same level of courtesy. "Thank you for inviting me." He nodded and turned back toward the group around him. The conversation continued as if I had never arrived. I stood there for a moment, listening. They talked about the company's future. They talked about a major investment that would allow Caldwell Technologies to expand into new markets. That was when I heard a name that caught my attention: Pierce Capital Group, the largest investment partner Caldwell Technologies had ever secured. Most people in the room spoke about Pierce Capital like it was some distant force, a powerful organization that had changed the direction of the company overnight. They did not know the full story. They only knew the result. Richard noticed me listening. "Interesting, isn't it?" he said. "That partnership changed everything." I looked at him. "Yes, it did." He smiled. "People underestimate how important relationships are in this industry." I almost laughed. Not because the statement was wrong, because he had no idea how accurate it was. Relationships were everything. Trust was everything. The reason Pierce Capital had invested in Caldwell Technologies was not because of a presentation or a flashy meeting. It was because someone had spent years studying the company, understanding its potential, and creating a strategy that made the investment possible. That person was me. But nobody in that room knew. Years earlier, before Claire became one of Caldwell's most recognized executives, I had been working behind the scenes with investors and advisors. I had helped identify opportunities that others ignored. I had built connections with people who valued careful decisions over public recognition. When Pierce Capital was searching for companies with long-term potential, my recommendations played a major role in where they placed their confidence. But I never attached my name to it. I never wanted credit. At the time, I believed the work mattered more than recognition. That was the kind of person I had always been. Claire walked over to me later that evening. "You seem quiet," she said. I looked at her. "I am just listening." She glanced around the room. "You know, this is what I meant yesterday. This environment is competitive. People notice confidence." I looked at the woman standing in front of me and remembered when she used to tell me that my ability to stay calm was one of the things she admired most. "Confidence is not always loud," I said. She smiled slightly. "Maybe, but sometimes people need to see what you bring to the table." I nodded. She had no idea how true those words were. A few minutes later, Richard stepped onto the stage to speak. The room became silent. He thanked his team, celebrated the company's growth, and talked about the importance of having the right people in the right positions. Then he mentioned the future of the company. "With the support of our largest investor, we are entering the next chapter of Caldwell Technologies." Everyone applauded. Everyone except me. Because I knew something Richard did not. The next chapter he was celebrating was built on a foundation he did not fully understand. And the person he had removed from his company was not the person who had lost. I watched Richard accept the applause and watched Claire smile beside him. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel invisible. I felt certain. Certain that people could underestimate you only until the truth had a reason to appear. And the truth was closer than any of them realized. The morning after the Caldwell Technologies event, I woke up to a message that changed the way I looked at everything. It was not from Claire. It was not from Richard. It was from someone who rarely contacted me unless something important happened. Jonathan Pierce. I stared at his name on my phone for several seconds before opening the message. "We need to discuss Caldwell's position. Call me when you are available." There were no details. No explanation. Just a simple sentence from a man who understood the weight of every decision he made. I sat on the edge of my bed, looking out at the quiet street below. A few years earlier, a message like this would have been normal. A business conversation. A strategic discussion. Something that belonged to a world I had intentionally stepped away from. But now, after being removed from Caldwell Technologies, it felt different. The same people who ignored my opinion yesterday would have been desperate to hear it if they knew who was asking for my time today. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. Claire was already gone. She had left early for work without saying much. That had become common lately. Our conversations had become short exchanges about schedules and responsibilities. We had stopped talking about dreams. We had stopped talking about the things that once connected us. I looked at the empty chair across from me and thought about how strange it was. 12 years together, and somehow we had reached a point where two people could share a home and still feel miles apart. I called Jonathan later that morning. He answered after the first ring. "Ethan," he said, "I was hoping you would call quickly." "What happened?" I asked. There was a pause. "Richard Caldwell is making decisions that concern us." I leaned back in my chair. "What kind of decisions?" Jonathan explained that Caldwell Technologies was preparing for a major expansion. On paper, it looked like a strong move. The company had impressive growth numbers, a talented executive team, and a respected brand. But numbers alone never told the complete story. Jonathan had concerns about the direction Richard was taking. Too much confidence. Too many assumptions. Too little attention to long-term stability. I listened quietly. This was the part most people never saw. The business world was not only about presentations and public announcements. It was about understanding people, understanding their decisions, understanding what happened when pressure arrived. "Do you still trust your original assessment of Caldwell?" Jonathan asked. That question took me back years. I remembered reviewing the company when it was still considered a risky investment. I remembered hours of research, conversations with employees, and meetings where people focused only on immediate results. I saw something different. I saw potential, but potential required leadership. It required patience. I trusted the company, I said. I was never sure about the people controlling it. Jonathan was quiet for a moment. "That is what I thought you would say." After the call ended, I walked into my office and opened the folder I had kept hidden for years. Inside were notes, reports, and documents from the early days of the Caldwell investment. Not because I wanted power, not because I wanted control, because I believed responsibility mattered. When I first helped connect Pierce Capital with Caldwell Technologies, I made one condition clear. The investment should support growth, but it should also protect the company's future. Jonathan agreed because he understood the same principle I did. A company was not just numbers on a spreadsheet. It was people, employees, families, customers, a reputation built over time. But Richard had forgotten something important. Leadership was not about being the person everyone listened to. Leadership was about making decisions that deserved to be trusted. That afternoon, I received another message. This time from Claire. "Can we talk tonight?" I looked at the screen. A few weeks earlier, that message would have made me hopeful. Now, it only made me curious. When she arrived home, she seemed different, more thoughtful, less certain. She placed her keys on the counter and looked at me. "I heard Jonathan Pierce contacted you." I did not respond immediately. "How did you hear that?" She looked away for a moment. "People talk." I studied her expression. For the first time in a long time, I saw uncertainty. "Why does that matter?" I asked. Claire took a breath. "Because Pierce Capital is important to Caldwell." There was something hidden in her voice. Something she was not saying. She was beginning to realize there were parts of my life she never understood. "Ethan," she said quietly, "what exactly was your role with that investment?" It was the question I knew would eventually come. I looked at her and thought about everything that had happened. The dismissal, the laughter, the way she had looked at me like I had become someone smaller. "I helped build the foundation," I said. She frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" I held her gaze. "It means people have been looking at the wrong person." For the first time, Claire did not have an answer. And in that silence, I knew the balance between us had started to change. The following morning, I arrived at my office earlier than usual. Not the office at Caldwell Technologies. Not the glass building where people measured success by job titles and corner rooms. My office was a smaller space in my home, a place where I kept years of notes, research, and decisions that most people never knew existed. The sunlight came through the window, landing across the folders on my desk. For years, those documents represented work I never talked about. Now they represented something different. A truth that could no longer stay hidden. I opened my laptop and reviewed the information Jonathan Pierce had sent me. The situation at Caldwell Technologies was more complicated than I expected. Richard Caldwell had accelerated expansion plans, but the decisions were creating uncertainty among investors. The company was growing quickly, but growth without discipline was dangerous. I had seen this pattern before. Leaders became focused on appearing successful instead of building something sustainable. Richard was not a careless man. That was what made the situation more complicated. He was intelligent. He was ambitious. But ambition without patience often led people to ignore the details that mattered most. I spent years studying companies like Caldwell. I learned that the biggest problems rarely appeared in financial reports first. They appeared in the small decisions people made when they believed nobody was paying attention. I received another call from Jonathan that afternoon. "Ethan, there is something else you need to know," he said. His voice was calm, but I could tell the information mattered. "What is it?" I asked. "Richard believes Pierce Capital is fully committed to his expansion plan." I looked down at the documents on my desk. "And is it?" Jonathan paused. "That depends on whether the company returns to the principles that made us invest in the first place." That answer told me everything. Jonathan was not asking me to interfere. He was asking me to make a decision I had avoided for years. I had always believed the best way to influence people was through good ideas, not recognition. I never wanted attention. I never wanted people to know my name. But there was a difference between humility and allowing someone to erase your contribution completely. That evening, Claire came home earlier than usual. She walked into the kitchen and immediately noticed the folder sitting on the table. "Is that about Caldwell?" she asked. I closed it gently. "Yes." She stood there for a moment, choosing her words carefully. That alone was unusual. Claire had always been direct, confident, certain, but now she seemed unsure. "Ethan, I need to understand something," she said. "Why did you never tell me?" I looked at her. "Tell you what?" She moved closer. "About your connection with Pierce Capital. About your role in all of this." I thought about that question. It was simple, but the answer was not. "Because I never thought I needed to prove myself to you." The room became quiet. Claire looked down. For the first time in a long time, I saw her thinking about the past instead of defending the present. "I thought you had stopped trying," she said softly. I nodded. "I know. But that was not true." It was not a question. It was a realization. I did not respond immediately. Some truths were more powerful when people discovered them on their own. I spent years building relationships and helping companies make better decisions. I finally said, "I just never needed everyone to know my name." Claire sat down across from me. "So when Richard fired you," I looked at her. "He made a decision without knowing the full picture." She was silent. That was the first time I saw something change in her expression. Not admiration. Not yet. Something more basic. Understanding. The next morning, I received an invitation to a private meeting with Jonathan and several members of Pierce Capital's advisory team. They wanted my perspective before making any decisions about Caldwell Technologies. I arrived at the meeting room in downtown Chicago and saw people who had known my work for years. People who did not need an introduction. They did not see me as a former employee. They saw me as someone whose judgment they trusted. "Ethan," Jonathan said, standing to greet me, "we need your recommendation." I looked around the room. A few days earlier, I had been standing in a hallway watching people walk past me like I did not matter. Now I was sitting at a table where one conversation could change the future of a major company. The difference was not that I had become someone new. The difference was that people were finally seeing what had been there all along. I opened the report in front of me and began speaking. Calmly, clearly, without anger. Because this was never about proving Richard wrong. It was about making sure the right decision was made. And as I explained what Caldwell needed to do next, I realized something important. The most powerful moment was not when people discovered who I was. It was when I stopped needing them to discover it. The boardroom on the 41st floor of Pierce Capital was quieter than I expected. There was no dramatic entrance. No celebration. No feeling of victory. Just a long table, a few carefully prepared reports, and people who understood that every decision carried consequences. That was the difference between this room and the one at Caldwell Technologies. At Caldwell, people cared about appearances. Here, people cared about outcomes. Jonathan Pierce sat across from me, reviewing the notes I had prepared. "You realize what happens if we move forward with this recommendation," he said. I nodded. "Yes. Richard will know something changed." I looked out through the windows at the Chicago skyline. Richard already changed something. He just does not know what it was. Jonathan gave a small smile. He knew exactly what I meant. For years, I had stayed behind the scenes because I believed the best decisions were not always made by the person standing in front of the cameras. I believed leadership was about responsibility, not recognition. But Richard had mistaken silence for weakness. That mistake was becoming expensive. After the meeting ended, I drove back home and thought about everything that had happened in just a few days. Losing my position at Caldwell had forced me to see things clearly. I had spent years protecting relationships, protecting opportunities, and protecting the company's future. But I had never protected my own reputation. I had allowed people to create a story about me because correcting them felt unnecessary. Now I understood something important. Sometimes the truth needs a voice. The next morning, Caldwell Technologies held an emergency executive meeting. I was not invited. At least, that was what Richard thought. He walked into the conference room expecting to discuss expansion plans, confident that everything was still under control. Claire sat near him with the other executives, reviewing documents and preparing for what they believed was another routine discussion. Then Richard received a message. He read it once, then again. The confidence on his face changed slightly. "What is it?" one executive asked. Richard looked up. "Pierce Capital has requested a review of our current strategy." The room became quiet. That was the first sign that something was different. Richard tried to remain calm. "This is normal. Major investors ask questions all the time." But the executives around him understood the seriousness. Pierce Capital was not just another investor. Their support had helped transform Caldwell Technologies from a growing company into a major industry player. Losing their confidence would change everything. Claire looked at Richard. Why would they request a review now? Richard did not answer immediately. Because the truth was uncomfortable. The person he had removed from the company was connected to the very foundation he was standing on. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Claire. Her voice sounded different. "Ethan, something is happening at Caldwell." I sat quietly before responding. "I know." "How do you know?" she asked. I looked at the documents on my desk. "Because I am part of the conversation." There was silence. Not the kind of silence from an argument. The kind of silence when someone realizes they have been missing a piece of the story. "What does that mean?" Claire asked. I took a breath. "It means the people making decisions about Caldwell are asking for my opinion." She did not respond right away. "Ethan, why did you keep this from me?" That question was complicated because the answer was not about business. It was about trust. "I did not keep it from you," I said. "I just never thought I needed to explain my value to my wife." The words were calm, but they carried years of disappointment. That evening, Claire came home earlier than usual. She sat across from me at the kitchen table. The same table where she had once told me about her dreams. The same table where she had looked at me after I lost my job and assumed I had lost my direction. "I owe you an apology," she said. I listened. "I judged you based on what I saw every day. I thought because you were quiet, you were standing still." I looked down at my coffee. "A lot of people make that mistake." She nodded slowly. I was one of them. For the first time in years, Claire was not looking at my position. She was looking at me. But I knew something. An apology could open a door. It could not erase what happened. The next day, Richard Caldwell would finally learn the truth he never bothered to discover. The person he removed was not the person who had failed him. He had removed the person who understood his company better than anyone else. And when that truth reached the boardroom, nobody would be able to ignore it anymore. The morning of the board meeting arrived with a strange sense of calm. I had expected to feel nervous. I thought maybe there would be a part of me that wanted to see Richard Caldwell embarrassed or forced to admit he was wrong. But when I sat in the back of the conference room at Pierce Capital, I realized something important. I was not there to watch someone lose. I was there because a decision needed to be made. That difference changed everything. The meeting began at 9 o'clock sharp. Jonathan Pierce sat at the head of the table, surrounded by advisors and investment leaders who had spent years studying markets, companies, and people. A large screen displayed Caldwell Technologies' latest reports. The numbers looked impressive at first glance. Revenue was growing. Expansion plans looked ambitious. The company had attracted attention across the industry. But numbers only told part of the story. "The question is not whether Caldwell can grow," I said. "The question is whether it can grow responsibly." Everyone looked toward me. I continued explaining the concerns I had identified. The aggressive expansion timeline. The decisions being made too quickly. The lack of attention toward long-term stability. These were not problems that appeared overnight. They were small choices that had been ignored because the short-term results looked impressive. Jonathan listened carefully. "If you were still advising Caldwell directly, what would you tell Richard?" he asked. I thought about that question. A few days earlier, Richard had looked at me and decided I was no longer valuable. He had judged me based on my position instead of my contribution. But I did not want revenge. Revenge was emotional. Strategy was different. I would tell him the same thing I would tell anyone, I said. A successful company is not built by proving everyone else wrong. It is built by knowing when to adjust. After the meeting ended, Jonathan walked with me toward the elevator. You know what is interesting, he said. What? I asked. You could have made this personal. I smiled slightly. It was never about being right. Jonathan nodded. That is why people trust you. Later that afternoon, the decision was made. Pierce Capital would request a formal review of Caldwell Technologies' expansion strategy. It was not a punishment. It was a necessary step to protect the investment and the future of the company. But inside Caldwell's headquarters, the news created immediate tension. Richard received the official notice while sitting in his office. He read the message carefully. The review was professional. The language was respectful, but he understood what it meant. Someone with influence was questioning his direction. Someone who knew the company better than he realized. He called an executive meeting immediately. Claire sat across from him, watching his expression. Do you know who requested this? One executive asked. Richard looked at the documents again. No. The answer bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Richard was used to knowing everything happening inside his company. He believed information moved through him. But this time, there was a conversation happening without him. That was something he could not control. Meanwhile, Claire came home earlier than usual. She found me sitting in my office, reviewing notes. She stood at the doorway for a moment before speaking. I heard about the review. I looked up. I know. She stepped inside. Richard is worried. I closed the folder in front of me. He should focus on fixing the problems, not worrying about who found them. Claire nodded slowly. She seemed to understand the difference now. I spent a long time thinking success was about being recognized, she said. I thought if people knew your title, your position, your achievements, then they would respect you. I listened quietly. But I was wrong, she continued. I knew you before any of that mattered. Her words carried regret, but I also knew regret was not the same as change. Change required time. It required action. Claire, I said, the hardest part was never losing the job. She looked at me. Then what was it? I answered honestly. Realizing the person I expected to believe in me was the person who believed in me the least. She looked away. For once, she did not try to explain or defend herself. She simply accepted the truth. The next morning, I received an invitation from Caldwell Technologies. Not from Richard directly, from the board of directors. They wanted me present for the review meeting. The same company that had removed me days earlier was now asking for my perspective. I looked at the invitation on my screen and thought about how quickly circumstances could change. But I also knew something else. The goal was never to return to the place that had rejected me. The goal was to make sure people understood one simple truth. Value does not disappear just because someone refuses to see it. And soon, everyone inside Caldwell Technologies would understand exactly who they had underestimated. The invitation from Caldwell Technologies sat on my screen for several minutes before I accepted it. It was strange how quickly a place could change its attitude toward you. A few days earlier, I had walked out of that building carrying a box with my personal belongings while people quietly watched. Now the same company was asking me to sit at the table where decisions about its future would be made. But I did not see it as a victory. I saw it as a responsibility. When I arrived at Caldwell headquarters, the atmosphere felt different. The confidence that had filled the building before was replaced by uncertainty. Employees moved quickly through the halls, speaking in lower voices. Everyone knew something important was happening. The boardroom was already prepared when I entered. Richard Caldwell was sitting near the window, looking through documents. For the first time since I had known him, he did not look completely certain. He looked like someone trying to understand a situation that had moved beyond his control. His eyes met mine. There was a moment of silence. Ethan, he said. His voice was professional, but the confidence behind it was gone. I did not expect you to be part of this review. I placed my folder on the table. Neither did I. The board members arrived shortly after. They were not interested in personal disagreements. They wanted facts. They wanted to understand why Pierce Capital had requested a review and what needed to change. Jonathan Pierce joined through video conference. His presence immediately changed the tone of the room. Everyone respected him because he had a reputation for making careful decisions. Ethan has been involved in understanding this company's potential from the beginning, Jonathan explained. Richard looked surprised. Not because he heard my name, because he heard my history. From the beginning? Richard repeated. Jonathan nodded. Before Caldwell Technologies became what it is today, the room became quiet. I opened the documents in front of me and began explaining the situation. I did not criticize Richard. I did not mention the way he had dismissed me. I focused on the company, the risks, the opportunities, the changes needed to protect the future. That was always the difference between emotion and leadership. Emotion wanted people to understand how you were hurt. Leadership wanted to make sure the right decisions were made. As I continued, I noticed Richard listening more carefully. He was finally seeing the work he had never bothered to understand. The reports, the strategy, the connections, the years of preparation behind decisions that looked simple from the outside. After the meeting, the board members thanked me for my perspective. They did not treat me like someone returning for approval. They treated me like someone whose judgment mattered. Richard stayed behind after everyone left. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. "I owe you an explanation," he finally said. I looked at him. "About what?" He paused. "About how I handled everything." I knew exactly what he meant, but I also knew apologies were easy when circumstances changed. "Richard," I said calmly, "the problem was never that you made a business decision. Leaders have to make difficult decisions. The problem was that you made one without understanding the person you were deciding about." He lowered his eyes for a moment. It was the first time I had seen him without the confidence that usually surrounded him. Later that evening, I came home and found Claire waiting in the living room. She looked nervous, something I had rarely seen from her before. "How did it go?" she asked. I placed my keys on the table. "The board is reviewing the strategy." She nodded. "And Richard?" I looked at her. "He understands more now." Claire was quiet. Then she said something I did not expect. "I think I understand. More now, too." I sat down across from her. She took a breath. "I spent so much time admiring people because of their position, their influence, their success. I forgot the person who was beside me before any of that existed." Her words were honest, but I knew honesty was only the beginning. Trust was rebuilt through actions, not conversations. "Claire," I said, "I never needed you to think I was powerful. I needed you to believe I had value even when nobody else could see it." She looked at me with a sadness that was not about losing something. It was about finally understanding what had been overlooked. In the weeks that followed, Caldwell Technologies began making changes. The expansion plan was adjusted. The company returned to a more stable direction. Richard remained involved, but he approached decisions differently. He listened more. He asked better questions. And Claire began changing too. Not overnight. Not perfectly, but genuinely. As for me, I realized something I should have understood years earlier. Being underestimated can hurt, but it can also reveal the truth about the people around you. The people who only value what they can see will always miss what matters most. I never needed a title to become valuable. I only needed to remember that my worth was never determined by someone else's ability to recognize it.